often the injuries are catastrophic, or in some instances it's death. So we may be able to achieve a very hefty settlement, notwithstanding the comparative fault.
If you're injured while riding your motorcycle, do you know if you need an attorney who has experience in those kind of cases? Well, that's what we're going to ask the lawyer on today's episode. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com, and my guest is attorney J.D. Smith out of the Seattle area. J.D., thank you for making some time to help us out today.
Thank you.
So let's start off. What is your experience handling motorcycle collisions and injuries and that sort of thing, those sort of cases? Tell us about that.
I've been representing parties who are injured in all types of collisions and have had many instances represent those who have been injured on a motorcycle. But going back to my practice as a plaintiff's personal injury lawyer, I worked as a claim rep and underwriter for a large insurer, and then also defended those cases before I switched to the plaintiff side. So I have a vast amount of experience with motorcycle injury cases.
So that gives you an advantage because you can see it from both sides then.
Exactly.
And why is it important, JD, to have an attorney, a personal injury attorney who has experience in motorcycle cases? Are they not the same as any other automotive accident?
No, they are quite different. And I've done quite a bit of work in the area of focus groups. And what I've learned over the years is that a lot of jurors come into jury service believing that motorcyclists assume the risk. And when we talk about the concept of assumption of risk, at common law, it was an old concept that says, hey, it's your fault for being on the road. And so a lot of people have a bias against motorcyclists that they bring in. And so having a unique ability to see the other side and to know how insurance companies work has given me, I believe, a competitive advantage to lead to more resolutions or more effective outcomes at trial for my clients.
Well, with your unique experience, JD, what's your advice then for helping bikers be safer on the roadways? What sort of advice would you give them?
Well, probably the most common one is an easy one because we have a helmet law that requires a chin strap in Washington, but many cyclists might not be as uniquely aware of how motorists don't see them because of the size or maybe the lighting. But I would say drive defensively and even just cautiously, not to the point where you yourself are going to lay your bike down.
Right.
But I think just generally driving defensively and assuming that motorists don't see you, especially with things like passing on a highway or at intersections where the motorcyclists might have the right of way.
You mentioned the helmet law. What is the helmet law in Washington State? And secondly, if a rider is injured and they're not wearing a helmet, could they still have recoverable damages?
Yeah, so Washington law is fairly clear that helmets are required. And the one requirement is that it obviously covers your head, but it has a chin strap that holds it on. And the second part of your question is we have seen this both in the context of motorcycle injuries and bicycle injuries. Even though there's not a requirement statewide for bicyclists, some cities and counties have enacted ordinances that requires it for bicyclists. But in instances where someone is not wearing a helmet and injured on a motorcycle, they still can recover, but you do still have that bias from jurors that, particularly if it's a head injury, that head injury was avoidable. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't recover, but what I've seen is the verdicts are somewhat artificially lower in that setting, because in order to compel jurors to give higher amounts, what we see that normally drives that is a certain amount of anger because of the conduct of a defendant.
You've mentioned the bias against motorcycle riders a couple of times. Do insurance companies try to take advantage of that bias and sometimes even try to blame the riders for the problem when maybe it wouldn't be?
Yes, but that's across the board. It's not just motorcyclists, but in a lot of claims manuals, adjusters have a mandate that they have to achieve a certain percentage of comparative fault. And what you see sometimes is the claim reps are pushing these issues even when they're not really legitimate to that particular case. And what you'll often see is, well, your client was speeding, or your client failed to follow their affirmative duty to avoid a collision, or the sun was in our client's eye, or a bee stung them. But it's not just motorcyclists. You see that across the board, this concept that we have to deal with where the claims reps are blaming our clients to some degree.
Do you see, is it more complicated to gather evidence at the accident scene than, say, for a automobile collision?
It's much more difficult for a motorcyclist because, in my experience, the injuries are different because you don't have the protection that you do of a vehicle. For most people, there's obviously a lot of trauma, there's stress. But in the instances of motorcyclists, they're usually carried away on a motorcycle, or they're not mobile, so they're not able to do things like take pictures or exchange information. But that's where the police report is important. But also that's why it's important to hire a lawyer early, because one of the things that we do almost immediately is hire our own independent investigators.
And sooner rather than later, because evidence can have a way of disappearing.
Exactly. That's why it's so important. Even if people don't hire us, there are many times where we give advice that's invaluable, meaning whether they, decide to try to handle the case themselves. And many times when they do that, they end up calling back anyway. Or if they go with another lawyer, we still like to receive those calls so that we could get people pointed in the right direction.
You mentioned a minute ago something called comparative fault. Explain what that is and how that works in Washington State.
In Washington State, we have what is called a pure comparative fault, meaning that you, as a motorcyclist or a driver, you could be 50% at fault, truly 50%, but you still get to recover the 50% of the other driver or drivers who contributed to the collision. Some states have a comparative fault where if you're more than 50%, you're unable to recover. It serves as a bar. But ours is a pure comparative. So I use the 50% example, but you could also use, say, 90%. You could be 90% at fault, but if the other party is 10% at fault, you get to recover 10% of the value of your claim.
So even if you think, well, it might have been partly my fault, or maybe you're not sure, it's still, it pays to contact an attorney such as yourself and get that consultation.
Exactly, especially for motorcyclists, because often the injuries are catastrophic, right, or in some instances it's death. So we may be able to achieve a very hefty settlement, notwithstanding the comparative fault.
JD, what if people are thinking, I'm not sure I can afford an attorney to help me, and my life was just turned upside down? Maybe there's catastrophic injuries. What do you say to that? They say, what if I can't afford an attorney right now?
Well, fortunately, we're able to offer contingent fee arrangements, which means we don't require any money up front. The recovery is based on a percentage of recovery. Most across the board in our state, for clear liability cases, it's 1/3. If there's disputed liability, it's typically 40%. And in cases of litigation, it's often 40%. But that's a way that allows those who don't have money to pay up front to still retain a lawyer without having to pay up front. And we also typically cover all of the costs, and then those are reimbursed at the end of the case.
Great advice, great information, JD, as usual. Thank you for helping us out and answering our questions.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this episode of Ask the Lawyer. My guest has been Seattle attorney JD Smith. If you want the best information about motorcycle injury cases, or you'd like to be able to choose a lawyer that lawyers choose, make sure to go to askthelawyer.com. Also, please take a sec to like, share, and subscribe below so you'll know about future episodes. That's going to do it. Thanks for watching. I'm Rob Rosenthal with askthelawyer.com.